Welcome and thank you all for joining us. We're really delighted to have Courtney Martin in conversation with artist Thomas J. Price today. It is an extra bonus that the two have known each other for many years and that Courtney is very familiar with Thomas's work. To introduce our speakers, Courtney J. Martin is currently the director of the Yale Center for British Art. She was previously the director and chief curator at the Dia Art Foundation, as well as an assistant professor in the history of art and architecture at Brown University, and assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. In addition, Courtney was a chancellor's postdoctoral fellow in the history of art at the University of California, Berkeley, a fellow at the Getty Research Institute, and a fellow at the Henry Moore Institute. She also has worked in the Media, Arts, and Culture Unit of the Ford Foundation in New York. In 2015, she received an Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writer Grant. Courtney has curated many important exhibitions, including Drop, Roll, Slide, Drip, Frank Boland's Ford paintings at Tate Britain in 2012, and an exhibition of the work of Robert Ryman at the Dia Art Foundation in 2015. Also at Dia, she oversaw exhibitions of works by Dan Flavin, Sam Gilliam, Jacqueline Humphreys, Blinky Palermo, Dorothea Rockburn, and Andy Warhol. Courtney Martin received her doctorate from Yale University in 2009 for her research on 20th century British art. As a graduate student there, she contributed to the Yale Center for British Art's exhibition, Art and Emancipation in Jamaica. Welcome, Courtney. Artist Thomas J. Price lives in London. He studied at Chelsea College of Art from 2001 to 2004 and earned his MFA at the Royal College of Art Sculpture School in 2006. While his work is interdisciplinary, embracing photography, sculpture, and video, it thematically shares a fascination with the human body, its language, facial expression, and external presentation. In turn, Price recognizes the body's ability to suggest states of mind. Price has been making figurative sculptures, such as his newest one currently in Milwaukee, called Within the Folds Dialogue 1, since 2005. Often focusing on Black males, the sculptures represent an amalgamation of observed traits, ancient and historic sculpture sources, and typecasting represented by the media. Price has shown his work internationally, including selected solo exhibitions at the National Portrait Gallery in London, the Royal Academy of Arts London, Midland Arts Centre Birmingham, Royal College of Art London, Yorkshire Sculpture Park, Harwood House, and Hales Gallery London. Price has also been included in shows in the US and Europe, and his work is in a number of private and public collections. Welcome, Thomas and Courtney.
Thank you so much, Deborah and Mary Lou and everyone at Sculpture Milwaukee. And thanks also, it's good to see you, Thomas.
Good to see you too.
Yeah. I feel like you were one of the last people that I don't see regularly that I saw in real life. We had a great time earlier this year before, well, not before the pandemic, before we all recognized that there was a pandemic. So
really amping up, right? Yeah.
Things were really changing, and I don't, it feels like a very different world from then to now.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. I can't wait to start traveling again.
Exactly. One of the things I thought a lot about when we were talking in February was, where do you come to sculpture? I've never asked you that question. Did you always know that you were a sculptor specifically? Did you know that you were an artist as a child? And when do you make that break into sculpture?
That's a great question. Do you know, I've always approached kind of the world, I guess, as a sculptor, in the sense that the way I kind of feel things out, even the word, I guess, feel things out, it's very tangible, and it's very much about, space and volume and kind of the articulation of objects. I think I've responded to objects and real space in a way which is far more kind of natural than I would with like the kind of the illusionistic aspects of the two dimensions. Mm-hmm. I think that's why also I've kind of drawn to video, because it's sort of you can, because you have time, so you throw in that other dimension and it sort of fills it out for me, kind of makes it real again. But I think even as a kid, I was always making things. You know, kind of, I'd make things whilst watching the TV, or I'd make things whilst listening to music. You know, I mean, as like a young child, and you know, my mum used to take me around to. I was really lucky; she took me to the museums in London, and I was just like absolutely kind of drawn to the objects. I think like just the material of them, and what, you know, the kind of the mental weight of them, or the fragility of them. So I think I've always been into kind of things and objects.
What were you interested in? Do you remember any of your early?
Yeah, as I was saying, I was kind of walking through the British Museum, which obviously is a controversial place now, you know, that with our kind of the way that we contextualize things. But I remember like the Egyptian sculptures, and seeing the kind of the masses of stone, and some of the, and particularly the fractured elements. So you kind of see again like through the surface of the sculpted form into the material itself. And so for me, even as a kid, it would make me kind of give me a realization, or a sort of an understanding of the mass, and the kind of the sheer weight, and like the material, and then how someone, okay, I know like several artists would have worked that material to create these, you know, incredible representations of, well, for me, like psychological kind of propositions, but you know, these people, these gods or rulers. So I think, yeah, even back then it was kind of almost overwhelming, just this sense of material and the kind of human interaction with these materials to kind of create these specific forms.
Wow. You know, you have to forgive me. You know that I'm an art historian. So everything, my lens for the entire world is through the history of art. So I read a title like Within the Folds Dialogue 2, and immediately I ask myself, what's the fold?
Mm.
What's the fold, Thomas?
See, I was trying to be all kind of like, you know, ambiguous with the titles, and gently lead people to kind of create their own understanding of what the fold is. But I guess there is this sense of a fold being, you know, or twofold, being this idea of the drapery, the clothing. So it's an acknowledgement of art history, and of how sculptures like this, how these sort of monumental size sculptures have been rendered in throughout history. So the kind of the nods to the craftsmanship, the artistry, the skill of the artist, you know, the artist's hand in there, which sort of combines to create or to denote the importance of the individual represented. And then the other part of the fold is essentially about inclusion, or about being within something, and so therefore also kind of acknowledging to be outside of something. And you know, when you mix that with the types of people that I represent, it's really talking about who do we include, who do we consider within our fold. You know, what are our folds? You know, what are our groups? What are our communities? Where do we feel we belong? And so really, you know, the title is, you know, acknowledgement of art history, but also the history of societies, and this kind of, you know, us humans as social creatures, and the sort of recognition of belonging and not belonging.
I mean, I have to say that I look at a work like this, which right now is one of the few works of yours that I have not yet seen in real life. And so I'm so intrigued by how you've rendered this. And I think, you know, I think back immediately to what 17th century Baroque sculpture gave us in terms of the fold, in that sense, the drapery, the liveliness, the sense of dynamism that you're getting here. And yet you've done that to what we assume is a contemporary body. Why is this body, what makes it contemporary? When you talk about this idea of, you know, who's in your space, what is it that makes this body so known to us?
Well, for me, it's known because it's sort of based on people I see. It's based on elements of myself, elements of my family, elements of people I see from, you know, the area I live in the UK, in London, near my studio. And I think, you know, this idea of it being contemporary almost becomes a euphemism, you know, in the sense that throughout history, there have not really been, I would say, the kind of representations of Black people at this scale, in a way which sort of, which, I don't know, which acknowledges the individualism, acknowledges the complexity, and the the high status and value intrinsic to human beings, and I think it's, if you look at the clothing, he's got the hooded, the jumper, he's got, the trainers and, like, the Air Force Ones. All of these things are kind of like the elements that when I was growing up, I was told you shouldn't wear, because it's to kind of, that's going to get you in trouble. If you go outside into a public space, that's going to make you a prime target for, kind of the authorities to sort of have an excuse to stop you or to interfere with your daily, kind of life. And so I think, to present a sculpture in the material of bronze, this kind of historically important sort of high status material at a scale of 9 foot tall, to represent a fictional character who wears the clothing that you're not supposed to wear even at normal scale, is sort of an act of kind of defiance, but also it's about trying to embrace and present and sort of, not rebrand, but, like, present this image in a way which creates a sense of power and or value, that the viewer can pick up on.
One of the things that's really striking about the way that you describe this figure in space in general is that it's specific space. It is in a public plaza, downtown Milwaukee, but it is the plaza that was the US Bank Plaza. And you can see the older facade of the bank just sort of to the rear, off to the left of this figure. Perhaps if this figure were the everyday man that you depict him as walking through this space, in many ways what you describe as a kind of anonymous person, but also a person that might not necessarily be welcomed here or comfortable here or made uncomfortable by the presence of others who have, projected something onto him. So, yeah.
That's the important element. It's not me presenting this to an audience who perhaps don't recognize themselves in the sculpture. It's me really presenting this to people like myself, or people who do recognize themselves and can acknowledge and understand, sort of immediately that psychology you've just sort of talked, that dynamic of being in a space with people projecting onto you, and yet you become the focus. So someone who is potentially anonymous, the show I had at the power plant in Toronto was called, Ordinary Men, as a kind of a nod to that. This idea that, almost this desire to be anonymous, to be invisible, kind of how it plays with the reality of either people, picking you out visually or trying to ignore you visually so that they don't have to interact. So yeah, there's a lot of things going on.
This close-up, I find the way that you have rendered the skin here to be absolutely luminous. Can you talk a bit about the process? This is a silicon cast bronze. For those of us who are, are lay people here, tell us exactly what that means as a process.
So basically you start with, you start with a sculpture, an original. And over the years, I've used different types of clay. I've used wet clay, so water-based clay, oil-based clays, which kind of could take detail differently. The first sculpture I made on this scale was made with wet clay, with a huge scaffold around it. I've moved towards sculpting digitally, which allows me to kind of, it's less linear and more kind of, I can test out different versions of the same person, the same sculpture. But essentially you end up with an original model, which is then molded in silicone, like a flexible mold. And then a wax, a hollow wax is taken from that. That wax is then covered in a ceramic shell, and it has a core inserted into it, which is then used, this is all the lost wax casting process. And then that wax is melted out to create a void in the ceramic shell. And into that void is poured molten bronze in the case of my sculptures. And then you kind of end up with this lump of bronze, which looks a bit like the thing that you made. And then you have to kind of do the chasing, which is the finishing work. So filing, welding, putting the pieces together. And then once that has the kind of the bronze colored form, you can choose what coloring you put onto it, so the patination. And I choose a very specific black for my sculptures, really, I did it from the beginning because I wanted to. So I'm using bronze. I'm using this material that I talk about in terms of, you know, hierarchy of materials, the way of instilling value into a figure, a person, or representation of a person. But then I kind of placed this almost plastic-like black patina on it to again bring it into the contemporary, to attach it to the material of the everyday as well. So like something like a mobile phone, or these kind of, you know, these kind of high quality plastics, you know, this sort of the manufacture, things that people understand and interact with daily. So there's lots of games I play with material, with scale, the whole, you know, this idea of manufacture, production. They're, you know, they're amalgams, they're composites, you know, of fictional people. So it's, and you know, I love this picture because it gives you a sense of the scale and the sort of yeah, the bit before it's revealed to the public and goes out there. So it's just had, this is having the wax put on it. So once you use the heat and chemical treatment to create the color, it's then sealed with many layers of wax. But this has been used for, you know, thousands of years, this sort of process. That's why I like it.
I was just going to say, Thomas, you know, this is lost wax is an ancient technique. Did your training at Chelsea and later at the RCA actually give you those skills, or did you have to look deeper to find a more traditional kind of route? Because, you know, there are many sculptors working right now who work in ways that we might think of as being non-traditional or experimental, but in fact, you're doing something that has a far longer history.
I mean, I was very lucky that when I was studying, there was access to foundries and to people who had the technical knowledge and skills to try and teach. But you know, they're very complex processes. I would certainly not claim to have, you know, any great skill in them, but I was able to do my own casting and chasing and finishing. And I did my first bronzes, you know, quite a long time ago. But now I work, you know, I work with a team. I work with foundries, people who do this day in, day out. And I think one of the kind of the exciting things about sort of moving the career forward has been having access to people to work with who, you know, who can sort of take the burden of the physical time and kind of, yeah, sort of lighten that burden so that I can sort of really concentrate on how the thing ends up, how the thing looks, what are the ideas contained within it, what, you know, what is the work speaking to, as opposed to thinking, you know, all right, this is another 30 hours trying to weld this or kind of, you know, file this thing down. It's about sort of, yeah, sort of letting loose that creativity.
How did you start the process for this sculpture? I know that we're showing here an image of your digital model. Had you visited Milwaukee when you first started thinking about the commission? Tell me a bit about how.
I hadn't. No, yeah, I've been working on this kind of form and this sort of this reoccurring character with the sort of, for me, the quite iconic sportswear clothing. You know, one of the small figures I did in 2011 was called Sportswear, and a parenthesis Achilles Street. So I've always had this fascination with clothing, this idea of the sartorial choices we make, you know, interacting with other people, kind of the signaling we do, and also how people try and sort of ascertain how the people try to define us by what we wear, and so how we sort of play these games with people, or how that kind of that sort of visual interaction. But so I wanted to create this large figure who had this sort of, I say, iconic clothing. And so that process we were looking at before with the digital model, that's a mixture of 3D modeling that I've done in the computer, along with some 3D scans. So what I normally do is, it changes from sculpture to sculpture, but it's a bit of a mashup of different processes to create the right visual. So I'll often use 3D scan to create the kind of the framework for the stance, and then go into it and do what needs to be done in terms of moving it around. You know, you got to totally resurface it. You got to make the hands. You got to, you know, sculpt the head. But it's quite nice to have this sort of lump of a thing. I used to use tin foil, aluminum foil, and now I use, yeah, this kind of digital foil almost, as this thing to kind of push around in the computer. And then you get to kind of play with it afterwards. Once you sort of CNC'd it out, once you've carved it out and you've got it as a real physical object, you can go in and you can sort of redefine the surfaces, the positions. I mean, you basically make the sculpture, what you make it, the original model, then you make it again in the wax, and then you pretty much make it again in the bronze. So it's a very labor intensive process.
Wow. And so how long did it take for you to get to this point?
To finish this, what, to the shoe?
Yeah.
Goodness, that's a few months.
Okay.
I mean, it takes. I often get asked, how long does a sculpture take you, or how long does it take to sculpt one of these things, digitally? And it changes from piece to piece. And sometimes you could just, just in the flow, and I can just do it. And other times it's about finding that right, the right balance of elements that create the effect that I'm trying to get from the sculpture. And sometimes you only know what that effect is once you see it. And so, the close-up of the face, for me, I like seeing it because it had the effect that I was trying to go for, this sort of the balance of subtleties. So it's not just like an overtly defiant, or I like things that are ambiguous and which make the viewer connect to the work, because they're the ones essentially creating the work. They're the ones who are, projecting themselves. They bring themselves to these sculptures. And it's the way that the viewer sort of decodes or creates an identity for these figures. That's why the eyes are hollowed out, because the viewer essentially kind of projects themselves into the voids of the eyes. That last psychological sort of transaction, with the work.
And is that why you think there's such a question about this use of figuration? Because people seem to really ask that, just in looking at all the literature that your work has generated by others. There's so many questions about why you've turned to figuration. Has that ever been a question for you?
For me, it was the quickest and the most efficient way to connect to people, to connect to viewers, in a way which allowed, or I feel made the viewers feel able to comment and to interact with the work, to dissect the work, and to feel that they could talk about it, and so therefore bring themselves into this conversation about society and about interpersonal interactions, and bring themselves to the conversation, like their schemas, their learned behaviors, their learned attitudes toward things. I came from a background of very conceptual, abstract video and sound work, which I'm working on more stuff like that at the moment, actually. But so for me, these are abstract. These are conceptual works which sort of inhabit the world of figuration as a strategy for connecting to people, and for for opening themselves up for that sort of consumption by the viewer, and then it's sort of how the viewer then digests that visual image that I find really interesting. Oh, you got some heads.
I love this idea of figuration as a strategy. I don't know that we've had that conversation, in a sense, even though we've talked around it for at least a few years. Where do you go with works like this? Because where is our point of entry here? Because you've given us a head, there is no body. Do we still go to the eyes? Is there something else that we are, as viewers, that we're invited into?
So these were the earlier works I'd made. So I started with the heads and then progressed to the figures. And the one on the orange base is called Cornrows. And it was all about the hair for me. And the face was almost sort of a secondary thought. It was like the support for this amazing sort of arrangement of plaits. So he's got this, again, the black bronze, this fictional head, this very specific hairstyle on an automated spray painted base. This kind of orange base to sort of balance out the psychology. And I was using car spray painted bases as this way, as a kind of a way of looking at the plinths a bit like cars, and how both can sometimes be used as a way to create status, or to as a way to identify or a position of pride. Because the idea of the car being this, this precious object, or this thing that someone can sit in, and therefore they're sort of elevated if you've got a nice car or something like that. But this for me is again about the physiognomies. This is about the types of faces, and kind of how, as a whole, how does that affect the viewer's sense of what they're seeing? How does it affect the viewer's psychology? Is it some, there's so many different strands to it. It's quite funny to try and articulate it verbally, but there's have I seen this as a sculpture before? If so, what scale have I seen this? Because these are very small. Have I seen something like this on a base like this? Where have I seen this kind of, it's all about the viewer trying to kind of compile where they've seen these materials, where they've seen this aesthetic. As an object, how do I feel positioned next to this object? Do I loom over this object of a representation of someone that I may or may not feel like I know? So then what's that dynamic between this presumed identity of this figure, or this head, and the viewer's own identity? So there's all these sort of push and pull aspects, these static sculptures that the viewer has to move around, or can kind of visually encompass with one gaze, as opposed to the large figures which you have to kind of approach, and then the closer you get, the bigger they become. So there's a lot of the time with the smaller pieces, I was doing a lot of detail, so it sort of draw the viewer in and make them really invest some time in just looking at the object, and then before they know it, they're kind of face to face with this character, who might kind of then start to be created in their minds about who is this person. So there's lots of strings to the bow.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a series, I think, that you started in 2008, and I think that you call this series Nudes. That's the name of the whole series. Is that true?
Yes.
Tell us, where does this come from? I mean, there's a history of both male and female nudes. This is not new territory in that way, but there is something very interesting. Your nudes are not idealized, and I hate to say it, Thomas, these are not beautiful bodies. Where does this come from for you?
It is about, again, it's a kind of a critique of art history, in a sense, in terms of for me, the visual history of what we've seen presented in Western art as idealized bodies, as idealized sculptural forms. This is obviously a more naturalistic kind of Greek to Roman. I'm not got the Curie kind of stance here. This is very much kind of very well. The one on the left is more of a kind of a classical stance, and then when we start moving into more recognizable sort of everyday positions, the older guy with the hands sort of clenched, and I wanted to present a non-idealized body, male form, as a sculptural object in a material of power. So these again are bronze, but at a small scale, which sort of played with the way that we would feel about the power dynamic between ourselves and the person represented.
What is their height?
They're just under 2 foot tall each. I can't remember. They slightly vary, but for me, this was maybe it's a bit like when I looked at books as a teenager of art history, and there's something about looking at the scale of a book and this, but I wanted to kind of portray the signifiers, the watch on the one guy there, and the older guy has a ring, and it's these small details, these sort of clues to who this person might be or how they want to be perceived, or these, in the same way that when art historians or archaeologists were looking at fragments of sculptures found, at sites, they would identify the figures by the objects they had with them. Like I just think of like Hercules with, the club and the lion's pelt or something. It's who are these people? And I guess as the artist, I'm sort of playing that game of, find the clue, to draw the viewer in. So it's not just the physiognomy, the stance, it's the little details. Because I think also what I was doing with these is removing them from, and it's nice that they're on these backgrounds, is removing them from the environmental context. So these are the only pieces I have that have their own integrated little bases.
Wow.
But they're all the same. But it was about removing them from the environmental side of things. So kind of stripping away a lot of the information and making the viewer have to, again, bring themselves and their understandings to these objects without the other bits of information that they might hope to have in order to identify who they are.
It's funny because I went down a rabbit hole a few days ago when you first sent these images, and I was thinking about, I know that they have street names in Brixton, identifiable places. I know where Corinth Road is. And in the process of trying to figure out, I just wanted to see them in a map to see what the relationship between Corinth Road to Ducey Street were. I found, I got into two different stories that seemed so relevant to the way that you've placed these two images together, which is that Corinth Road is named after Frederick Snowden Corinth, who was a late 19th century MP. But he's a constructed man. His father didn't take on the name of Corinth until 1837. He goes to Cambridge sort of off the back of his father's trading. He becomes an army figure, and then sort of works his way up the ranks, and then he becomes an MP for East Suffolk. And so I'm looking at him, at this younger man, and thinking, he looks like someone who has had to be made, whereas Francis Reynolds Morton Ducey is actually an inherited title. He was the third Baron of Ducey and inherits it from his brother when he dies. And so he becomes an MP as well, but he is, he's Royal Navy. He was born to this. And then you think about that placement in Brixton, particularly given that Ducey is, that street name is given to recognize Ducey's work in the American Revolutionary War. Essentially that he commandeered what we know now as the Caribbean, the Anglophone Caribbean. And so held off the Americans, the fear that the Americans would make it to the West Indies. And I thought that's incredible that those two histories come together, at a certain kind of point in Brixton, and that then Brixton, this place that really is, I think, a focus for much of the city of London, has this other kind of history to it as well. And yet you captured these, I think, in both of these bodies.
Brixton, since I was born in Camberwell, just up the road, and I've always lived in Brixton, on the edge of Brixton. It used to be a country retreat for the wealthy, way back, and I kind of loved that, or I found that so interesting in terms of the usage of how these places, were established, and then what's happened to them, and the sort of, there's been this whole gentrification of Brixton, which has already happened, and I guess this, I love what you said about this. One was made, and the other one was born into it. For me, it kind of took me into thinking how all these characters are made. They're fictionalized, and I guess in a sense, it's sort of, I'm trying to push towards that understanding, that inquiry of how we're all made, how we're all kind of fictional. Our identities are varied depending on who's looking at us, depending on how we feel, on a particular day. The stories we tell ourselves, and then what's recorded officially. And I think that's why these sort of look like artifacts in a way, because I wanted to play with this idea, what was it, 2008, play this idea of almost an alternative history, and to create this sense of, or create an understanding of provenance, this idea of claiming one's history, claiming one's identity, creating one's own identity. So therefore, I've talked about intrinsic value and these ideas that these sculptures are self-contained, in fact that none of them are looking to the viewer to be validated, to be told that they exist. And so I think, I love the idea of the histories of this person creating themselves. And then, yeah, having maybe the things that signify that identity. But yeah, as you walk around London, it is very interesting to see how things have changed even in the last 15 years. And I'm sure there are people older than myself who are here like, it's amazing how things have changed in the last 30, 40 years. But yeah, I love this idea of locating individuals in areas which kind of talk about what might be expected within those areas. And I mean, I say like the sportswear on Achilles Street, which is near my studio in Deptford, again in South London. I love the fact that this again, a slightly overweight guy wearing an American football jersey. Kind of he's located in London. He looks like he might be from kind of West African descent with an American football jersey in the UK. I love to sort of bring in all these different elements and talking about the kind of the global nature of where we look to create our identities. Mm. Yeah, Orpheus Street. So I'm looking at the light. Yeah. I haven't seen him for a while.
Thomas, would you be open to taking questions from our audience? I think that we have a good number.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. So I've just been talking too much.
No, not at all. Let's see what we have here. Deb, do you have questions for us?
I'm just looking through them.
Are they about my background? Because I'm not really here, just,
Maybe a good place to start would be, someone asked if your interests and influences, what your interests and influences are from Western sculpture. We've talked about a lot of ancient sources, and they were wondering what would be Western sources. And then someone else asked in a related comment if you were at all influenced by Richmond Barthe, the Harlem Renaissance sculptor.
Yeah. So in terms of, do you mean like more contemporary Western influences? Is that what?
I'm not sure. Just the question asked.
I'll just ramble through them. Okay. Right. I mean, I love the work of Barthe, but I wasn't, in all honesty, my art history was lacking when I was studying. Mm-hmm. I was really responding to my understanding of the art history in terms of like the ancient. So what sort of neoclassical sculpture was pointing to, which was existing around London, around stately homes, and in kind of these in the museums in London particularly, which were all talking about grandeur, about the when people who were of recent history were represented in the like National Portrait Gallery, or the great men, their heads all sort of on the wall, or their figures standing there. They were all taking these neoclassical kind of an ancient Greek, Roman sort of nods to references. So I think I wanted to create people that I felt an affinity to and that challenged those presumptions of who we expect to see presented in that way. I wanted to create an alternative to that. And obviously, when you look at Barthe and the Harlem Renaissance and that hugely rich history there, there were people doing it, all during that time. But I'd say I've never really considered myself to be a figurative sculptor. It was more me taking this guise to as a strategy to kind of create that social conversation, or that conversation about society and about our learned expectations for the kind of the roles that we expect people to inhabit, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting, Thomas, that somebody also asked you as a part of that question about Barthe. I would bet you that at the moment at which you are getting, which you clearly, got an amazing art and art history training at both Chelsea and the RCA, that Barthe would not have been on a curriculum. at the point at which you were getting trained. And I would stretch to say that probably there might not be anyone teaching Barté in the last 4 or 5 years either in the UK. But that also, I would say that there probably aren't that many people teaching Barté in America throughout art history, which is a real lack. We have an incredibly good question from our dear friend, Bob Rennie, about your Windrush proposal. But can I just ask if you're willing to talk about your upcoming Windrush proposal, could you also, for those of us coming from the other side, can you just tell us a little bit about what the Windrush is?
Yeah, so post World War II, Windrush was called the Empire Windrush. Everyone takes that bit off it, but it was essentially immigration from the Caribbean after the UK government asked for help in rebuilding the nation's infrastructure. So it said, it needed workers in all the essential services. And so, the predominant country, I think, was Jamaica. So it sailed from Jamaica in 1947. And it basically heralded a huge beginning of immigration from the Caribbean to the UK. And so I'm part of that influx in terms of my grandmother, I think, came over as a nurse. And so it's really, it's a very important, in the UK, it's a very important moment of immigration. So a lot of origin stories can be, go back to the Windrush. And it was a great moment of hope and enthusiasm and people coming to create new lives and create a better country, or countries in the UK. And obviously, the reality, I think, of when people got here was somewhat different. And so there's a lot of stories in terms of lived experiences which stem from that original immigration into the UK. Now, Hackney is a borough, is a council in the UK, in London. And they've commissioned me to make a large outdoor work that's going to go outside the town hall, in this beautiful square outside the town hall in Hackney. And I'll be taking my sort of methodology and understandings of this idea of these kind of psychological spaces and working with amalgamated fictional people to try and create works which speak to everyone, but which really acknowledge the rich history of Windrush and the I think the bravery and enthusiasm and of everyone who came over through Windrush, and really make visible the contribution, the human contribution to the UK, and which becomes a marker, sort of literally creating images of Black people as the very fabric of British society in a non-apologetic, very visible way. 9 foot tall, bronze. Hopefully, the kind of humanistic elements will come through, because it's I want them to be works for everybody to try and connect to. But specifically, I want them to be works that Black people can feel visible and valued when they look at them as well.
I think this commission and the whole celebration of the commemoration of that period in the UK is also incredibly important, because by the time that the anniversary is upon us, that so many of the people who traveled over will have passed. And so it is really, it has now become a historical fact. And yet that lived experience, I think, for so many has been foregrounded, particularly very recently, because there have been so many people who came as children, who were sort of the children of Windrush, or who came, immediately thereafter, who have had real problems with immigration that I think that has become a real issue in your country.
The Windrush scandal, which continues. Yeah, it's so hard to really deal with the almost the lack of humanity, the way that people are being treated, because you don't have, or because the government lost the paperwork or never asked for the paperwork in the beginning. They therefore say that after, people who've never even been to Jamaica are told that, well, you're not a UK citizen. You know, we don't have you on record, so you're going to have to go back to the country that we deem you to be from. And so you've got people who are literally being sent back. You know, there's supposed to be flights going out or to Jamaica, people who are British, and it's, yeah, I find it hard to deal with the lack of humanity when it comes to these sort of, I think it's a let off to say bureaucratic decisions. The people who paid taxes their whole life, who contributed, you know, worked, who are British, who have made Britain, and they're just shipped off. So yeah, I think creating something which can be a focal point for visibility, for the value, to say, you know, the humanity of and the reality of these people, for me is very important. So obviously, you know, I'm going to go and meet the residents in Hackney and who are attached to Windrush. I'll be doing kind of loose interviews, photographs, scans, sketches, all sorts of things. You know, trying to get a sense of who's there, who's been there, to create these works, which hopefully will help the UK recognize the contribution and the existence of this really rich history.
Yeah.
We have a question about whether you are now beginning to represent women, make figures of women, and I think perhaps you are. But does that represent an entirely different set of concerns? Because obviously that history isn't really in the ancient world. So it's a different trajectory for you, I would think. Yeah,
it's interesting. For a long time, I had to try to work out what I was doing with my works anyway, you know, with the practice. But, you know, I really came from this kind of humanistic starting point. So it wasn't even about race. It was about what it means to be human, what it means to transcend these sort of visual shells that we have and connect a psychological space to another psychological space. So the psychological space that I create in the sculptures or the video works to the viewer. And then it became very apparent to me that, you know, people couldn't get past, or people were very much taken with the racial type or perceived racial type of the people I was depicting. And it created, you know, this very interesting and very important conversation about how we see people, what we expect from people, and the histories of being Black in the UK and globally in a white dominated world, basically. So I was dealing specifically with how the Black male body was treated in space and how that was received in space, you know, and I think that came from a very personal perspective. And then I did start to sculpt women quite early on. But I always felt a bit like I didn't want to do it in the way that you know, the kind of the nymph that had just been discovered, or this rather horrendous more recent kind of Western history of depicting women in sculpture by male sculptors. So I made them much more active. You know, they were the Samson character in my sculptures, or they were the ones who that the sculpture was really about. And then I think just as I sort of worked through my practice, and I had more chances to talk to Black women particularly, and to show work and to create an understanding in the world about what I was doing and what I had been doing, it sort of suddenly it clicked with a piece called "Lay It Down on the Edge of Beauty," which is this medium-sized bronze head of a woman, a young woman, which has a kind of her laid edges. That was more about appropriation and this idea of what is beauty, and Black women often being kept on the edge of beauty, you know, whilst the elements that are deemed attractive to Western society are almost like taken from them, placed on white models, photographed, you know, and presented as new and beautiful. And it was within the process of making that sculpture that I realized that I didn't have to do anything special, and I wasn't making work about being men. I wasn't really making work about being women. I was making work about being human and having this kind of, I don't know, this kind of trying to have a truthfulness to this vulnerability and an openness to these sculptures being read as human beings. So yeah, I've recently made a 9-foot figure of a woman called Reaching Out, which is installed on the line in London, which hopefully, and one is going to Vancouver, which was just about being human. But obviously, the visual information that's there, being a woman is part of that, being black is part of that, the clothing that's being worn is part of that, the fact that she's on a phone is all part of the information I am feeding the viewer, essentially. And I think I don't know, I felt, I guess it's I felt just more confident with the work and able to let the viewers free to kind of make their decisions. Do you know what I mean? I'm making work about being human, and gender obviously is a part of how we clearly decipher things in this world. But as an artist, it's my main concern is really that the psychological truth of what I'm trying to distill into these objects.
We have time for a few more questions.
Let's go for it.
One just popped up. I'll just read it as it popped up. Through the years and how your work has naturally evolved, especially in public open spaces, have you felt a conscious move toward actively encouraging empowerment or even activism within the community through their response to your work? Or is this somewhat incidental to the work or placement? I think she's asking if the citing of the piece is very, very specific to maybe activist or political concerns ever. I think I'm translating that correctly. Courtney, does that sound like what she's asking?
Sorry, I think so.
I think I got it.
And maybe on top of that question, a broad question about, do you have any favorite sightings of your work? Where the work was installed and you went to this place and it was just absolutely perfection and magic, and the environment, the placement, the sculpture was all just happening. Or does that always happen for you?
I mean, when the first large figure I made was in a response to a reaction I had to a smaller version of the sculpture, which was considered too controversial to place in the public space as a 3-foot sculpture. It's called Network, and there's one in the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. There's one in London. And so for me, that piece was about, again, creating this authentic psychological sort of manifestation of a human being, and the subsequent citing and locating of these works is always a source of excitement and sometimes anxiety for me, because until the work's there, you never quite know how it's going to be activated, because I have an edition of Network in London, and then there's an edition in the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which is obviously beautifully kind of created, natural environment with rolling hills and trees and lakes, and it does create a different expectation of what's going to be seen there, and so that becomes part of the context within which the viewers, people see the works and forms part of the conversation for the works. We look at the piece in Milwaukee, standing there in front of the glass building with the flag, and I haven't visited it personally. Hopefully I will do, but image-wise, it creates very specific context. So I think to go to your second question. When I went to the York Sculpture Park and I saw the piece for the first time outdoors, So originally the 9 foot piece was indoors, and I saw it for the first time outdoors, and I was very worried about how it would be in terms of scale. Would it be swallowed up by the landscape? And I saw that it existed perfectly. I mean, you walked up to it, you weren't quite sure the scale, and as you approached the sculpture, it loomed large, and it loomed large in a way which I think drew me and drew the viewers in, as opposed to push them back in a sort of oppressive way. So it's a tricky question to answer succinctly. I love seeing the works go to different environments, because you never quite know how they're gonna be activated. But I think the main thing is that if the object, if the figure is made in a way which is authentic, then it so far it hasn't really mattered where they've been. They've always done something.
Wow. Thomas, that's wonderful. This has been such a great hour. I can't believe that our time is up.
Oh goodness! Right,
Let's make a plan. Let's meet in Milwaukee as soon as we can.
That'd be lovely. Yeah, that'd be really good. It's been such a great experience showing work in Milwaukee. It really has.